In the autumn of 1888, a series of brutal murders in the East End of London lit a flame that sent shockwaves reverberating around the civilized world and caused a scandal that struck right at the heart of the British establishment. London in 1888 was the world's largest capital city. Queen Victoria sat upon the throne of England and ruled an empire that was ever expanding. She had recently celebrated 50 glorious years as monarch. Her subjects seemed confident, entrepreneurial and determined. The City of London, the financial boiler room that powered the empire and its expansion, reflected the supreme confidence of the age. Yet right on its doorstep lay the district of Whitechapel, a sordid, crime-ridden quarter where vice, violence and drunkenness flourished, and where 76,000 residents lived in abject poverty.
The East End really was outcast London. In 1883, when the chairman for the London school boards did a report, he reported that out of sort of 1,129 families, 871 of them were living in rooms just one room big, and up to 9 people per room.
Whitechapel had the capital's worst slums, worst overcrowding and highest death rates. It was also the immigrant district, and the 1880s had seen a huge influx of Jewish refugees fleeing persecution in Russia, Poland and Romania. Parts of Whitechapel had the appearance of a foreign town, whose inhabitants, mostly lower-class Jews, spoke their own language and dressed differently to the other citizens of the East End.
There was a very large Jewish community in the East End. There had been a huge immigration into the East End in 1880s. The immigrants were living in a way that was different to the Gentile population, and a lot of the Gentile population resented that. Not so much resented the fact that these people were Jewish, although there was anti-Semitism.
Inevitably, this led to a certain amount of racial tension, as these immigrants were accused of taking English jobs and English homes. But whether they were Jew or Gentile, all those who lived in the area shared one thing in common. Life was a daily battle for survival.
The area was terribly overcrowded. People lived crammed together in miserable circumstances, in absolutely dire poverty.
All arches damp and dripping, and there was sort of straw on the floor and lots of horse dropping, all horses everywhere.
The area was very, very grim, very poverty-stricken. There's no sanitation. There's just off the main highways and byways, you've got loads of alleyways and courts with people just throwing out their sewage and their rubbish. I mean, the stench must have been awful in the East End.
For the poor and destitute, the main accommodation was offered by the common lodging houses. There were 233 of them in Whitechapel, and each night 8,500 men, women and children sought shelter within their decaying walls.
Now, if you were in a common lodging house, because of course nobody could afford their own sort of flat or house, it would cost you 8 pence for a double bed, 4 pence for a single one, and if you couldn't afford that, for 2pence you could go to sleep standing up, lined up against a rope, stretched from one side of the room to the other, and hundreds of men, women and children did that every night in Whitechapel.
For the women, there were few career opportunities, and those that were available paid a pittance, barely enough to cover the cost of a bed in a common lodging house, and certainly not enough to pay for food as well. So many of them turned to prostitution, not out of any real choice, but out of a necessity to survive.
The Met actually sort of estimated that there were over 1,200 prostitutes of a very low class actually working in Whitechapel.
On the surface, Victorian London may have seemed supremely confident and eminently respectable, but beneath that surface there lurked a general feeling of extreme unease.
In the 1880s, you had all these different fears and anxieties, and this kind of social fear, really, of things that were going on, the changes to the ordered society that the middle classes and the upper classes were so used to. And it was a period where a lot of people were frightened. There was a genuine fear that there was going to be a revolution. The East End came to be the focus for all of that anxiety, all of that social anxiety. Jack the Ripper came along at just the right time, in just the right place, and he frightened people in the same way as all these other fears were frightening people. And so Jack the Ripper, in many ways, became the embodiment, the physical embodiment of all of those anxieties. If the Ripper could step across the border from the poverty-stricken, immoral East End and infect the rest of London, then so could all of these other kind of nebulous fears spill across and bring about an awful lot of social unrest and social change. But the fact is that it did penetrate the consciousness of the people in a way that an ordinary murderer hadn't done in the past and would never do again.
It's 1 a.m, September the 30th, 1888. Jack the Ripper has just murdered his third victim, Elizabeth Stride. Her body lies not a quarter of a mile away on Berners Street to my left. He's now on the run from his first murder and on the hunt for his second victim of the night, and we're going to track him every step of the way. Our route begins here at Aldgate Tube Station. From the station entrance, turn right and proceed down Aldgate High Street, passing St Botolph's Church on the right. Earlier on that fateful evening, Catherine Eddowes, a local prostitute, had been released from police custody for drunkenness. Her last known words to the desk sergeant as she left the station were, "Good night, old cock," and went off into the night. We're now walking along Aldgate High Street, passing St Botolph's Church. In 1888, this was reputedly known as Prostitute Island, on account of the fact the prostitutes used to circle it looking for clients. It is possible that the Ripper, on the run from Berners Street, may have met Catherine Eddowes here, and the two of them then headed across Duke's Place, just as we are about to do now. We know they stopped to talk because at approximately 1:35 a.m, a positive identification was made by one of three men who were leaving an Imperial Club that stood here on Duke's Place. They noticed a man and a woman talking with one another at this corner of St James's Passage and Mitre Square. As they passed, Levy observed to Harris, "I don't like going home by myself when I see those characters about," and they crossed the road in disgust. But Joseph Lavender was trailing a short distance behind the other two and took little more notice. Lavender didn't see the woman's face as she had her back to him, but he later identified Catherine Eddowes' clothing as that worn by the woman. He also gave the police a description of the man. In a brief glance, he noticed the man was about 5'6", aged about 30. He had a fresh complexion, fair hair, a moustache, and the overall appearance of a sailor. Almost immediately after being spotted, the Ripper would have walked with Catherine Eddowes the short distance through St James's Passage into Mitre Square, just as we're doing now. We can be certain of this time frame because within 10 minutes of their being seen, Catherine Eddowes had been savagely slaughtered. I'm now going to show you exactly where Catherine Eddowes was found. If you look into the square from its east end, you'll see a flower bed on the west side. On a sunny day, workers often sit on the benches with their sandwiches at lunchtime. Few, if any of them, are aware that they sit next to the very spot where the murder took place. Many of the buildings here have changed, but you can still picture how the square would have looked. Over there was the warehouse of Keeley and Tong. And here are the original cobblestones over which P.C. Watkins, the constable who discovered the body, would have walked. He would later state, "I have been in the force for a long while, but I never saw such a sight. The body had been ripped open like a pig in the market." killer had been denied his satisfaction of mutilating the body of Elizabeth Stride, his appetite had been more than satisfied on the body of the unfortunate Catherine Eddowes. She lay on her back here, her head turned towards the left shoulder. Her throat had been cut back to her spine. A V had been cut into her cheeks and eyelids. The tip of the nose was detached. Her abdomen had been laid open, the intestines tucked out and laid over her shoulder, while missing from the body were the uterus and left kidney. Her blood would have been washed away from the very cobblestones under my feet. These flowers unintentionally provide a fitting memorial to poor Catherine Eddowes, Jack the Ripper's fourth victim.